The wind howled across the Montana plains, carrying with it a bitter chill that cut through even the thickest coat. Dust swirled in the pale morning light, stirring the tall grasses that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. Amid this harsh, quiet landscape, Jared Calloway moved with the steady rhythm of a man accustomed to solitude. His broad hands, calloused from years of labor, adjusted the feed for the horses, and he glanced once at the lined shack that had been his home and sanctuary since the day he lost her. The memory of his wife lingered in every corner of the cabin, the worn rocking chair by the hearth, the small garden she had tended with love, and the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling stubbornly to the walls. Life had been simpler then, before tragedy had struck and left him alone in a world that felt colder than the harsh Montana winters. Jared had learned to rely on no one, to trust only the land and the animals that shared it with him. People came and went, but grief, he discovered, had a way of rooting itself deep, where no visitor could reach. On that morning, he worked silently, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had mastered his routine. There was a quiet dignity in his solitude, a careful watchfulness that kept him safe from both nature's cruelty and human folly. Yet, even as he tended his chores, there was a tension in the air, subtle and unrelenting, as though the land itself whispered of change. By midday, a sleet storm had begun to gather along the ridge, dark clouds rolling in with the promise of a harsh night. Jared tightened the scarf around his neck and wiped his hands on his coat. He had faced storms before, storms of snow, storms of loneliness, storms of loss, but this one carried something different. It felt as though it were searching, reaching, and soon enough, it would find him. He first saw her near the barn, a small figure slumped against the rough wooden boards, half hidden by the swirling snow. At first, he thought she might be a traveler caught off guard by the storm, but as he drew closer, he realized she was in trouble. Her body shivered violently, and her skin, pale against the streaked mud of the barnyard, betrayed the chill that had seeped into her bones. Jared paused, studying the stranger. She made no sound, and he noticed, with a mix of concern and wariness, that her lips did not move. There was an air about her, a stillness that spoke louder than words ever could. Her clothes were torn, muddied by travel or perhaps by some misfortune he could not yet know. Something about her struck him as both fragile and unyielding, a puzzle that called to the man who had long forgotten the company of another human soul. He stepped forward, careful not to startle her. "Hey, you all right?" His voice broke through the storm, rough but steady. No answer came. He frowned, glancing around the empty yard. The snow fell faster now, frosting the earth in white and driving him toward a decision. Jared hesitated. He had kept himself isolated for years, guarding the memory of his wife like a sacred trust. He didn't know this woman, didn't know why she had come or what she wanted, yet something in her silent plea stirred a response he hadn't felt in a long time. Compassion, buried under layers of grief and caution, began to stir. "Come on," he said, reaching for her arm gently. "You're not staying out here in this storm." At first, she resisted, small movements of refusal, but her strength had waned, and her body finally sagged into his steady support. Jared carried her into the warmth of the cabin, the wind outside shrieking like a predator denied its prey. As he lay her near the fire, he studied her features, sharp cheekbones softened by fatigue, eyes wide and wary, and a silence that felt almost purposeful, like a secret held too tightly to let slip. The storm outside raged, and Jared sat back on the edge of the wooden chair, watching her carefully. She didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe audibly, yet in that silence there was a tension that promised change. Jared knew, with a sinking certainty, that his quiet life had just been interrupted, and whatever this woman carried with her, it was going to demand more from him than he had expected in years. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and old leather, a familiar comfort to Jared, but tonight it felt different, charged with the tension of an unexpected presence. Lydia Marsh, the silent woman he had taken in, remained still on the blanket near the hearth. Her eyes, wide and alert, flicked toward every shadow cast by the dancing firelight. She said nothing, not a word, only tracing careful movements with her hands when she adjusted her position. Jared watched her closely, feeling the weight of the silence settle like snow in the room. He moved about the cabin, feeding the horses through the open stable door, stacking firewood, and preparing a simple meal. All the while, Lydia's eyes followed him, unblinking, like she was studying his every gesture. It unnerved him more than the storm outside. Jared had spent years alone, and while he had grown used to the quiet, this was different. This silence was deliberate, almost a challenge, and it made him uneasy. After supper, he tried to coax her into speaking. "You hungry?" he asked, offering a bowl of stew. She shook her head, but her fingers lingered near the edge, as if acknowledging the gesture. Jared sighed. Frustration gnawed at him. He wasn't used to people who didn't speak, who didn't answer when spoken to. He had always believed in action, in the work of hands and the honesty of words. Lydia, with her quiet demeanor, offered neither. The first signs of tension on the ranch began that night. Tools that had been left neatly in the corner were slightly displaced in the morning. A horseshoe was missing, and footprints, too large to belong to a child, appeared along the frost-covered path. Jared frowned, his protective instincts on high alert. He glanced toward Lydia, wondering if she had seen something or perhaps caused it. But she was sitting silently by the fire, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin. As the hours passed, small sounds from the woods reminded him that the storm could not hide everything. A branch snapped in the wind, or was it footsteps? Something moved beyond the edge of the property, unseen but felt, leaving Jared restless and watchful. He tried to study Lydia, searching her expressions for a clue, anything to explain the unease that had settled in the air. But her face revealed nothing, and the silence between them grew heavy, almost tangible. Even in the quiet moments, there was friction. Jared wanted answers. Why had she come to the ranch? What dangers had driven her from the town, and why would she not speak? He felt a protective pull toward her, mingled with irritation at her lack of communication. It was a complicated knot of concern and frustration, one that reminded him of how much life had changed since he lost his wife. Solitude had been simple, this was not. Night fell, and the storm continued its relentless march across the plains. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled and cast long shadows across the walls. Lydia sat up, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face, and finally looked at him directly. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, but still silent. Jared approached cautiously, offering her a blanket for warmth. She accepted it with a nod, still saying nothing, yet the faintest trace of acknowledgement passed between them. That night, as he lay awake on the cot near the fire, Jared couldn't shake the feeling that Lydia's arrival was not a coincidence. Something about her seemed connected to the disturbances around the ranch, the missing tools, the footprints, the feeling of being watched. And yet, despite his unease, he felt compelled to protect her. It was as though a long-dormant part of him, a part that had known companionship and trust, was waking again. By the time the first gray light of dawn seeped through the cabin windows, Jared had resolved to keep her safe, whatever the cost. The storm would pass, the world outside would continue its harsh rhythm, but inside the cabin, a new tension had taken root, one that would test his patience, his courage, and eventually, his heart. Lydia Marsh was not just a stranger in need, she was a puzzle he could not ignore, and the quiet she carried promised challenges that he could neither anticipate nor avoid. Days passed on the Montana plains, and the storm that had driven Lydia Marsh to Jared Calloway's ranch finally relented, leaving behind a quiet frost that sparkled under the pale winter sun. Jared moved through his chores with his usual precision, but the presence of Lydia had shifted the rhythm of his life. He found himself stealing glances at her as she sat near the fire, quietly mending her torn clothing or simply watching the world outside. Her silence remained unbroken, and yet, there was a subtle grace in her stillness that drew him in, compelling his attention even as it frustrated him. Jared began to notice details he hadn't before, the way she flinched at sudden noises, the careful way she moved around the cabin, and the sharpness of her gaze whenever she looked toward the tree line. There was a tension about her, a quiet alertness that seemed to extend beyond the walls of the shack. He couldn't tell if she feared him, or if she feared something else entirely. Whatever it was, it unsettled him. Outside the cabin, signs of unease on the ranch multiplied. Tracks led from the edge of the woods to the barn, large and deliberate, but they disappeared before reaching the main door. A horseshoe vanished only to reappear days later in the snow, half-buried and frost-encrusted. At first, Jared thought it could be a trick of the wind or a careless animal, but the feeling of being watched persisted, a subtle and chilling presence that made him tighten his grip on the reins and sharpen his senses. Despite the growing tension, Jared felt a need to protect Lydia, even as her silence gnawed at him. He tried small attempts at conversation, casual questions about her journey or her past, only to be met with polite but unwavering stillness. Each refusal to speak was a small challenge to his patience, a puzzle he could not ignore. Yet, the more he observed her, the more he realized that her silence was not mere fear, it was intentional. She had chosen it, and he sensed it was tied to something far larger than his understanding. One evening, as the last light of day bled through the frost-covered windows, Jared noticed movement near the edge of the property. A shadowy figure slipped between the trees, unseen but unmistakable. His pulse quickened, and he called for the horses to be brought closer to the barn, preparing for the possibility of danger. Lydia, watching from the cabin, rose and met his gaze. For the first time, her eyes conveyed something unspoken but unmistakable, awareness. She understood more than she had let on, and Jared realized she was more than a helpless guest. That night, they moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, preparing the few defenses the isolated ranch could muster. Jared's trust in her grew, though he remained cautious. Her skills were apparent even without words. She moved with precision, checking windows, adjusting firewood, and scanning the tree line as if reading signals invisible to him. Jared, impressed despite himself, began to see her not as a silent woman but as someone who could help him face dangers he hadn't thought possible alone. By the third night in this fragile routine, tension hung in the cabin like smoke from the hearth. Jared found himself stealing glances at Lydia, noticing small, human gestures, the way her fingers brushed the edge of the table, the careful way she folded her blanket. He felt a strange mix of frustration and admiration. She was a mystery, yes, but one that tugged at a part of him he thought had died with his wife, the desire to connect, to rely on someone, to trust again. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying a scent of trouble across the plains. The tracks from the shadowy figure had returned, closer this time, circling the barn and the cabin. Jared tightened his coat and moved silently to the window, scanning the tree line. Lydia was there beside him, her presence calm but alert, her eyes sharp. It was then he understood, fully and without doubt, she was no ordinary traveler. She was capable, aware, and prepared. And whatever had driven her to the ranch, it was far from over. Jared felt a flicker of anticipation beneath the tension. The silent days were ending, and soon, everything would change. He only didn't yet know how, or whether he was ready for what was coming. Night had fallen again over the Montana plains, and the frost lay thick upon the earth. Inside the cabin, the fire cast warm, flickering light across the rough-hewn walls. Jared Calloway sat near the hearth, sharpening his knives while listening to the wind wail outside. For 3 days and nights, Lydia Marsh had remained silent, her presence quiet yet unyielding, like a shadow that refused to be ignored. Each glance she gave him, each subtle movement, had stirred both curiosity and frustration within him. The cabin was still, save for the occasional crackle from the hearth. Jared's hands paused in their work as he noticed Lydia step closer to the fire, her eyes fixed on the flames. She had been watching him all evening, as though measuring his strength, his patience, his resolve. There was an unspoken challenge in her gaze, and Jared felt a stir in his chest, a mixture of tension and intrigue he hadn't experienced in years. He set down the knife and spoke softly, "You've been through a lot, I can see that, but I need to know, why are you here? What are you running from?" His voice carried over the crackle of firewood, steady but gentle. For a long moment, Lydia did not respond. She simply watched him, her lips pressed together, her hands resting lightly on the blanket she had been adjusting. Then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was low but firm, carrying a strength that belied her fragile appearance. "I know who's coming for you." The words cut through the silence like a gunshot. Jared froze, his heart pounding, every muscle tensing as he processed the statement. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The outlaw. The one who's been hunting your family. I know where he's been, and I know how he moves." Her eyes locked onto his, steady and unwavering. For the first time, the mystery of her silence began to unravel. She wasn't timid or broken, she was deliberate, cautious, and skilled. She had remained silent for her own protection, and now, in the safety of his cabin, she was revealing the truth that could save their lives. Jared felt a rush of relief mingled with awe. Lydia wasn't just a silent stranger, she was a tracker, a survivor, and someone who understood the dangers that lurked beyond the tree-line. His mind raced as he absorbed the gravity of her revelation. Every instinct, honed from years of life on the frontier, told him that her knowledge was precise, accurate, and life-saving. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, a new determination rising in his chest. Lydia's lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, as if acknowledging his readiness. "Trust me," she said simply. That single sentence, spoken with quiet authority, shifted the dynamic between them. Jared realized that the bond forming was not just about survival, it was about trust, respect, and the kind of connection that grows when lives depend on one another. They spent the next hour planning. Jared moved through the cabin with purpose, gathering weapons, securing doors, and readying the barn for defense. Lydia moved beside him seamlessly, guiding his actions, pointing out vulnerabilities in the perimeter, and quietly marking the tracks outside. There was no need for excessive conversation, their coordination was instinctual, built on mutual understanding and necessity. As the night deepened, Jared allowed himself a rare moment to study her. The firelight highlighted the lines of her face, the intensity of her eyes, and the quiet strength she carried in every movement. He realized that Lydia's presence was no longer a disruption to his solitary life, it was a force that demanded he see beyond his grief, beyond the walls he had built around his heart. Outside, the wind howled, and distant shadows hinted at the approaching danger. Inside, a new understanding had taken root. Jared knew, with a certainty that filled him both with anticipation and dread, that the coming days would test them both in ways neither could yet imagine. And as he looked at Lydia, silent no longer, he sensed that the story of this stormy night had only just begun. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered on the Montana plains. Frost clung to the edges of the barn, and the wind whispered through the tall grasses like a warning of what was to come. Jared Calloway moved with purpose that morning, preparing the ranch for the inevitable confrontation. He had always been self-reliant, relying on his skill with horses, rifles, and the land itself. But now, with Lydia Marsh at his side, he realized that trust, true trust, was a weapon as important as any rifle. Lydia moved silently through the cabin, checking windows and doors with careful precision. Her sharp eyes scanned the surrounding trees and ridges, noting small details that Jared would have overlooked. She pointed to a section of the fence that could be weak under pressure, adjusted the placement of the barn gate to create a defensive line, and marked the tracks in the snow outside. Each movement spoke of experience, of someone who had survived threats far greater than a lone outlaw. Jared watched her, a mix of admiration and unease stirring in his chest. He had grown used to solitude, and yet the thought of facing danger alongside Lydia felt different. It was charged with tension, and with a strange, unspoken connection. Her presence demanded that he rely on her, that he let go of the need to control everything, even if just for a moment. As the day wore on, the tension around the ranch grew thicker. Footprints appeared again in the frost, deliberate and close, circling the barn as if testing the defenses. Jared felt the familiar thrill of adrenaline, the kind that sharpened his senses and made every sound, every shadow, a potential threat. He moved beside Lydia, coordinating their actions wordlessly. Her gestures, precise and deliberate, guided him as he set traps, checked the horses, and ensured that nothing was left to chance. The growing trust between them was subtle but undeniable. Every glance, every shared movement, carried an unspoken understanding. Jared found himself watching her more than the tracks or the approaching danger, drawn to her quiet strength, to the way she met his gaze without fear. He had not expected to feel this way, this mixture of respect, attraction, and a fragile hope, but it was there, lingering beneath the tension of survival. As evening approached, the wind shifted, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of smoke and distant horses. The outlaw was near, moving closer to the ranch with careful steps. Jared's hands tightened around his rifle, and Lydia signaled toward the tree lean, indicating where they should be most alert. Together, they moved with a silent rhythm, checking the barn, the cabin, and the surrounding land. Every movement was purposeful, every glance deliberate. The sense of impending danger created a strange intimacy between them. Jared realized that survival was no longer the only thing at stake. There was a growing bond, forged in necessity, trust, and mutual respect. Each moment spent in careful coordination with Lydia revealed more of her skill, her courage, and the quiet power she carried despite her earlier silence. Night fell fully, and the first stars appeared above the frost-covered plains. Jared and Lydia took their positions near the cabin, alert to every sound. A shadow moved among the trees, and Jared's heart skipped a beat. He could see the outline of a man, cautious, calculating, approaching the barn. Lydia's hand brushed his arm, a small, unspoken signal that they were ready. For the first time since his wife's passing, Jared felt a sense of partnership. He was not alone in facing the threat. Lydia's presence transformed his approach, giving him confidence, focus, and a renewed sense of purpose. Whatever the outlaw intended, they would face it together, relying on skill, trust, and an unspoken bond that had begun to form between them. And as the shadow crept closer, Jared realized that this night would not only test their survival but also the fragile, growing connection that had begun to bloom amidst the cold and quiet of the Montana frontier. The night was black and cold, the Montana plains shrouded in a thick fog that clung to the frost-covered grass. Jared Calloway crouched near the cabin door, rifle in hand, listening to every creak of wood and whisper of the wind. Beside him, Lydia Marsh moved silently, her eyes sharp and alert, scanning the tree lean for any sign of the approaching outlaw. They were a team now, each relying on the other in ways Jared had never imagined possible. A shadow shifted near the barn, and Jared's pulse quickened. The outlaw had come, deliberate in his approach, unaware that the man he sought to threaten was prepared. Lydia's hand brushed against his arm, a silent signal that the danger was near, and Jared nodded, understanding without words. This was the moment they had been readying for, the test of skill, courage, and trust that would decide everything. The first figure emerged from the fog, cautious, glancing toward the cabin. Jared steadied his rifle, breathing evenly, while Lydia positioned herself near the barn entrance, ready to intercept. With practiced precision, she guided Jared to a vantage point that gave him a clear line of sight while keeping their movements hidden. The tension was thick, every heartbeat magnified in the cold night air. The outlaw stepped closer, unaware of the trap waiting for him. Jared's finger tightened on the trigger, but he didn't act immediately. Instead, he relied on Lydia's signals, trusting her judgment, her knowledge of tracking and strategy. She had led him to this point, and now it was time to act together. Suddenly, the outlaw lunged toward the barn, attempting to cut off any escape. Lydia moved like a shadow, intercepting him with swift, controlled precision. Jared fired a warning shot into the snow nearby, startling the man and giving Lydia the advantage. The outlaw faltered, glancing wildly at the cabin where Jared waited, and in that moment, they were a unit, their coordination seamless, instinctive. Jared marveled at her skill, the way she anticipated the outlaw's movements, guiding him silently toward capture. He realized that Lydia was more than a survivor, she was a protector, a strategist, and a force he had never expected to rely upon. In the heat of the moment, his admiration deepened into something more, a connection forged in danger and trust. The outlaw, realizing he was cornered, attempted one last desperate attack. Jared and Lydia moved in tandem, anticipating his every move. A well-placed kick from Lydia sent him stumbling, and Jared quickly restrained him, the rifle still poised as a warning. The confrontation was over, the immediate threat removed, and the stillness of the plains returned, punctuated only by their heavy breathing. As the adrenaline faded, Jared lowered his rifle and studied Lydia. She was calm, composed, yet there was a spark in her eyes, a quiet satisfaction in their victory. For the first time, he allowed himself to see her not just as a stranger or a protector, but as someone who had become essential to his life, someone who had restored a measure of hope he thought was lost forever. They moved inside the cabin, closing the door against the cold night and the danger that had passed. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. Jared found himself standing close to her, noticing the faint lines of fatigue on her face, the strength in her posture, and the quiet determination that had guided them both through the night. In the silence that followed, a subtle shift passed between them. Words were unnecessary, the bond had been formed in action, trust, and mutual respect. Jared realized that he had not just survived the night, he had discovered a partner, a companion, someone who could share the burdens of life and danger on the Montana frontier. Outside, the wind whispered across the plains, carrying away the traces of the outlaw's presence. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, filled not only with firelight but with the unspoken promise of connection, trust, and a future neither of them had anticipated. The showdown was over, but something far more profound had begun. The first light of dawn crept over the Montana plains, brushing the frost-covered ground with pale gold. The wind had calmed, and the quiet that followed the night's confrontation felt almost sacred. Jared Calloway stood outside the cabin, rifle now resting against the wall, as he surveyed the ranch. The outlaw was gone, either captured or driven off, and the immediate threat that had haunted them was finally behind them. Inside, Lydia Marsh moved quietly, tending to small tasks with a calm efficiency. The fire in the hearth crackled, sending warm light across the cabin and illuminating the small, shared space that had become their temporary refuge. Jared watched her for a moment, noticing the subtle relaxation in her posture, the way her shoulders finally seemed less tense. She had been on edge for days, every movement measured and careful, and now, for the first time, she allowed herself to breathe. The victory over the outlaw had done more than protect the ranch, it had forged a connection between them. Jared realized how deeply he had come to rely on her, how instinctively he had followed her lead, and how natural it felt to stand beside her in the face of danger. The tension that had once felt heavy now carried warmth, a silent acknowledgement of trust, respect, and something unspoken that went beyond mere survival. They moved through the cabin together, side by side, gathering tools and checking supplies as they had done countless times during the confrontation. There was a rhythm to their movements, a quiet harmony born from shared experience. Jared noticed the small gestures, Lydia adjusting a blanket, pausing to glance at him briefly, the hint of a smile that flickered across her lips. These small, human moments, once hidden behind her silence, now hinted at the bond that had begun to form. Outside, the snow sparkled under the growing light, and the ranch seemed to breathe again. The animals, once restless and uneasy, had calmed, sensing the change in the air. Jared's heart felt lighter, unburdened by the constant weight of anticipation and fear. He had faced the danger, endured the uncertainty, and come through not only unbroken but transformed. Lydia's presence had shifted the balance of his world, filling a space he had long believed empty forever. For the first time since she had arrived, they spoke without urgency. Words were simple, but they carried depth. Jared asked about her past, and while Lydia's answers were measured and careful, there was a sense of openness, of trust beginning to blossom. They shared small stories, fragments of lives lived separately yet now intertwined by circumstance and courage. The silence that had once separated them had given way to conversation, tentative but genuine, a bridge across the divide that had kept them strangers. As the morning sun rose higher, Jared found himself standing near Lydia, the warmth of the cabin and the fire reflected in her eyes. He felt a stirring he had not known in years, hope, a fragile yet insistent promise of companionship and connection. He realized that the quiet bond they had forged in the shadow of danger had become something deeper, something neither of them could deny. Lydia paused by the window, looking out across the frost-covered plains. Her eyes softened as she glanced at Jared, and he understood without words that she had found not just safety but acceptance here. The ranch, once a place of isolation and grief, now felt like a home in every sense of the word. Together, they had survived, and together, they could face whatever the future might bring. In that quiet morning, the Montana plains seemed to hold its breath, honoring the resilience, trust, and unspoken affection that had grown between them. Jared realized that life on the frontier was harsh, unpredictable, and often lonely, but with Lydia by his side, it could also be filled with hope, partnership, and the beginnings of something lasting. The danger had passed, but the connection they shared was just beginning to bloom, promising warmth and companionship in a world that had long been cold and unforgiving. The sun rose fully over the Montana plains, spilling golden light across the frost-covered fields and painting the distant ridges in warm hues. Jared Calloway stood outside the cabin, the chill of the morning fading in the soft warmth of daylight. For the first time in years, the ranch felt alive, not just with the animals and the land, but with a sense of possibility and hope that had long been absent from his life. Lydia Marsh moved beside him, her coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders, the morning light illuminating the determination and quiet strength in her eyes. She had been silent when she first arrived, and her presence had carried mystery and tension, but now she walked with purpose, confidence, and the subtle ease of someone who had found safety and belonging. Jared watched her, feeling an unfamiliar stirring in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire they had kept burning through the long nights. The ranch, once a place of isolation and grief, now held the promise of new beginnings. Jared thought back to the first night, when he had found her collapsed near the barn, shivering and mute, a stranger with secrets and shadows following her. He had hesitated, wary of bringing another into his carefully contained world. But from that first touch of her hand in his, from the subtle gestures and silent communication, something had shifted. Their lives, once separate and burdened with loneliness, had intertwined. They moved through the morning routine together, checking on the horses and the few livestock, ensuring that everything was in order after the tension of the past days. Jared noted the way Lydia handled each task with skill and care, her movements precise yet graceful. She was no longer just a silent guest or a mystery to solve, she was a partner, someone whose presence complemented his own, and whose strengths balanced his. As they paused near the barn, Jared found himself looking at her in a way he had not before, not with curiosity or caution, but with recognition of the bond that had grown between them. The ordeal of the outlaw, the tense nights, the trust forged in danger, all of it had led to this moment. He realized he no longer wanted to live in isolation, no longer wanted to guard his heart behind walls of grief. There was a new chapter ahead, one that promised connection, partnership, and perhaps something deeper. Lydia glanced toward him, her expression softening. There was no need for words, the quiet between them carried all the understanding and affection they had built. In her eyes, Jared saw the reflection of his own feelings, a mix of respect, gratitude, and the tentative stirrings of something more. He reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and for a moment, the world beyond the ranch ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, standing together on the edge of a frontier that was harsh, unpredictable, but now full of possibility. The wind rustled through the grasses, carrying with it the scent of snow melting and the faint fragrance of pine. The land, once cold and unyielding, seemed to welcome the change, embracing the warmth and trust that had grown within the cabin walls. Jared felt a deep sense of peace, the kind that comes after surviving trials and emerging stronger, wiser, and open to life once again. He looked at Lydia and smiled, a small, genuine curve of the lips that spoke volumes. "You're not leaving, are you?" he asked softly, though he knew the answer. She shook her head, returning his smile with one of her own, quiet but full of meaning. Together, they would face the future, hand in hand, hearts no longer burdened by the shadows of the past. As the sun climbed higher over the Montana plains, casting long golden beams across the frost, Jared and Lydia stood side by side, ready to meet whatever the frontier had in store for them. The silence that had once separated them was gone, replaced by connection, trust, and the promise of a shared life. In that moment, the ranch was no longer just a place of survival, it was home, a place where hearts could heal, and where love, slow and steady, could finally take root. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss another tale from the Wild West.